Hello and welcome to another episode of TDNY. This day, not year. The podcast that looks back at the history of the week ahead. I'm your host, Adam, and I've curated a selection of 7 historical stories, events, or occasions that occurred over the dates of the coming week. What dates in particular? Well, this episode will be looking at May 5th to May 11th. And over those days, we will learn why you should wear gloves with your stockings, why Irish farmers are great to have in your corner, the quickest way to travel from England to Australia in the 1860s, which author hated one of the fairy tale greats, plus a whole lot more along the way. We also have our regular song pairing for each story, and the quiz at the end of the episode, if you want to play along. So, let's kick this week off with Monday, May 5th. On this day, not year, the first trial to really point the finger started. Brothers Alfred and Albert Stratton stood accused. A robbery gone wrong had left behind 2 corpses, but also something else. Something that would connect them to the crime. But first, let's go back to the morning in question. London, March 27th, 1905. Thomas Farrow, 71, and his wife Anne Farrow, 65, were asleep in their flat. It was located above Chapman's Oil and Colour Shop, where Thomas was the manager. Early morning, before the milkman had even been, a rapping at the door drew Thomas from bed. He could have ignored the early morning calling, but if it also woke up the canaries or parrot, it was likely no one would be getting back to sleep. Making his way downstairs, through the shop and to the door, Thomas was confronted by 2 men wearing stockings over their heads. They shoved him inside, and a fight ensued. Tables and chairs were knocked over. Thomas was knocked down, but kept getting back up, fighting back. The chaos alerted Anne upstairs, and one of the intruders went up to silence her with a bonk on the head. Finally, the fighting was over. The intruders had located the store's cash box, containing all of the unbanked profits for the week. £13 total. It may not sound like much of a score today, and it wasn't really much of a score back in the early 1900s either. The intruders emptied the box out, supposedly only leaving behind a single penny. Although, unknown to them, they had also left behind a very compromising piece of evidence. Something that criminals of this era had yet to learn to be wary of. Fingerprints. Carefully preserved on the tin cash box was the print from the right thumb of Alfred Stratton. When 16-year-old William Jones arrived for work, only to find the store still closed, he found help to force the door open and discovered the grisly scene inside. Thomas was already dead, while Anne was unconscious and would never awaken. Police arrived, photographed the scene, and preserved the evidence. Some eyewitness testimony from those seeing the duo flee the crime scene gave the police a basic description to be on the lookout for, and with a corroborating testimony from Alfred Stratton's partner, including that she had given them a pair of stockings the night before the robbery, led the police to detaining the Stratton pair. Although the evidence was just circumstantial at first, as soon as the brothers were fingerprinted, it was found that Alfred's right thumb matched 11 points on the thumbprint from the cash box. Before we go much further with the story, let's take a closer look at fingerprints. Back in the 1900s, fingerprints were categorized into 4 types. Whorls, loops, and arches were the most common, with accidental being the 4th type, and basically contained anything that wasn't a whirl, loop, or arch. It was known as far back as 1788 that fingerprints were unique to each person, with the German anatomist Johann Christoph Andreas Mayer writing, "Although the arrangement of skin ridges is never duplicated in two persons, nevertheless the similarities are closer among some individuals." It wasn't until the late 1800s that French scientist Paul-Jean Coulier developed ways to transfer fingerprint residue from objects and for storage that it began to be of more interest to police and in criminal investigations. Something that evidently caught the eye of writer Mark Twain, as fingerprint identification in a court case served as the climax in a story in his 1883 Life on the Mississippi. By the time the Stratton brothers were arrested, Scotland Yard had built up a database of nearly 90,000 sets of fingerprints, and could use them to rule out suspects. While fingerprints are the most commonly unique identifier left behind by gloveless criminals, they aren't the only unique marker on the body. It turns out our toe prints are just as unique as are our tongue prints. So my advice to any would-be bandits: shoes on, gloves on, and don't go around licking the crime scene. Now, what of these 11 points that matched between the thumbprint on the cash box and Alfred Stratton's own thumb? Well, Scotland Yard, in their dactyloscopy, or fingerprint identification study, had found, much like German Johann all those years prior, that some fingerprints are similar. They allowed up to 3 similar points as the maximum amount of similarities between 2 different prints. 4, and it was almost certain to be from the same person. So, with 11 points of similarities, it was beyond a question that Alfred had been the one to leave behind the print on the cash box. So, when the Stratton brothers were brought before court on this day in 1905, all of the above points were made before the jurors. As the fingerprint was the only tangible piece of evidence, it needed to be stressed how reliable it was. A reprinting of the case in an Australian paper 3 months later detailing, "The murderer, in the hurry and horror of his crime, had grasped the lid where the money lay concealed. In the darkness of the night, he had touched that thing, and now, in the broad daylight of open court, that little finger mark cried out loudly against him." The next day, after 2 hours of deliberation, the jurors found the Stratton brothers guilty, and they were to be executed for their crimes on the 23rd of May. Just like that, a murder case solved by a fingerprint. Although this was the first murder case in England to be solved by the use of fingerprints, it wasn't the first case in the world. That honour goes to Alphonse Bertillon in 1902, a French police officer. My song pairing for this story is a rarely played Rolling Stones song. The 1974 funk rock Fingerprint File. Tuesday, May 6th. On this day, not year, the Irish repaid a century-old kindness. Cast your mind back, if you can, to the long-lost year of 2020. A virus was dominating the news cycle, sending the world into a panic, catching leaders unawares. Without delving too deep into the failures, it could be said that America wasn't keeping on top of the COVID-19 pandemic, and it was often some of the poorest and most unprotected that paid the highest price in this. Outside of major cities, it was the Native American communities that were being hit the hardest by the virus, the Navajo Nation being one of the worst off. The American government put aside hundreds of millions of dollars to help, but it was another source of charity that really highlighted the best of humanity. 175 years prior, and over 4,000 miles away from America, Ireland was suffering through their own pandemic, the potato famine. We've talked before in episode 7 about the importance of diversity in a crop, as much like with the Gros Michel bananas, a single disease can nearly wipe them from existence, which is what was happening in Ireland in 1845. Ignoring a lot of socio-economic problems inherited from the British rule, not for lack of importance, just a lack of time, Ireland was heavily reliant on potatoes as a crop to feed up to half of the country and a majority of the lower class. The potato in question was the Irish lumper, able to grow in poor quality soil that is devoid of essential nutrients, made it a popular choice for farmers and a common choice on Irish dinner plates. Only Phytophthora infestans, also known as potato blight, had other ideas. This fungus-like infection rots the potato from the inside out, before spreading to other nearby potato plants. The infected potatoes were impossible to consume, and as they had made up a majority of the diet, soon many began to grow hungry. The uninfected crops still had to be sold to meet quotas, while the remainder was inedible. Between the years of 1845 to 1852, it is estimated nearly 1 million Irish died from hunger or direct effects from the lack of nutrients, while an estimated 2 million fled the country, packing ships and hoping to reach distant shores before they too perished. The population of Ireland dropped by half in the 50 years after the potato famine started. The news of the famine spread around the world, and soon a very unexpected measure of goodwill reached Ireland. It was a sum of $170, worth about 5,000 USD today. A drop in the bucket compared to what the Irish needed. But the money was passed out, used to buy provisions, new seed stock, etc., and did help many Irish survive. What was more interesting was where the money had arrived from. America. Specifically, the Choctaw Nation of Native Americans. It's not known how they knew of the famine, but something about the situation resonated with the Choctaw, who had recently been forced from their own lands and suffered massive losses within their own numbers. Connor Donman, a historian, sums it up by stating, "Here were multiple indigenous communities, imagining they're in the same colonial sphere as the Irish, both oppressed by imperialism." The donation wasn't a lot, but it surely saved lives, and the Irish never forgot the simple gesture from a different culture across the world. 173 years later, as a GoFundMe campaign was being set up to provide donations to the indigenous American communities struggling with COVID, an Irish journalist retweeted the GoFundMe link, and the cause ignited a cultural memory across Ireland that, on this day, paid off their debt and then some. Over 20,000 donations from Ireland to our GoFundMe campaign, and that's amounted to over $670,000 in donations. It's just incredible, the generosity the Irish people have shown to the Navajo Nation. Ethel Branch, organizer of the COVID-19 Relief Fund, was quoted as saying in an interview, "All this goes to show that old saying of what goes around comes around isn't too far off the mark." My pairing for this story is from an Australian band, the Screaming Jets, with Helping Hand. The chorus of "Won't someone please understand? Won't someone lend me a helping hand?" definitely rings true to the core of our story today. Wednesday, May 7th. On this day, not year, we're bound for South Australia, via the city of Adelaide. If you find yourself in Port Adelaide, you can visit a rather curious sight. A ship that sunk in Scotland some 10,000 miles or 15,000 kilometres away, now sitting on dry land. The 74-metre or 244-foot long and near 6-metre or 18 feet deep ship sits by the water without her masts, wooden sections rotted away, wind whistling in through broken windows and rotten timber. Tours of the ship have turned up some oddities, creaking boards on a still day, voices just out of sight when no one else should be aboard, a hammock swinging away despite no one touching it. Others have seen movements out of the corner of their eye, one person even swearing to have seen a pair of legs walk down the stairs and off the ship one night. It's no surprise tales such as these are associated with the ship. Its appearance aside, it did spend time as a hospital ship, looking after those dying from plagues. But all that is getting ahead of ourselves. The city of Adelaide, as the clipper ship was called, was launched on this day in 1864. Built by Pyle, Hay & Co. under the direction of a trio of investors, including one David Bruce, a 48-year-old Scottish captain. He already had a regular route, travelling to Adelaide on the ship Irene, but this new ship was a clipper, and it would be faster than the passenger ship. A clipper, as per Wikipedia, was a type of mid-19th century merchant sailing vessel designed for speed, of American design and used for the tea trade to stop it degrading on the way back from China. Clippers were generally smaller, narrower, more streamlined than other ships of the day. A clipper couldn't carry as much, but it could get you where you were going quickly. For comparison, nearly 100 years prior, the first fleet took 252 days to get from England to Sydney. Meanwhile, the city of Adelaide once clocked in a run of just 65 days getting from England to Adelaide. The city of Adelaide helped carry migrants to South Australia, and across her 23 years making voyages, it is thought that now 250,000 Australians can trace their ancestry back to settlers carried across on the clipper. Meanwhile, the return trip to London would see it carrying passengers again, but also cargo, mostly wool, back for sale in England. Eventually, Captain David Bruce gave over command of the city of Adelaide to his son, Captain John Bruce. During his first trip to Adelaide, the clipper met another ship on the way, the Lena, captained by a man called Opdal, sailing with his wife who had fallen ill. She was transferred to the clipper, but died en route to Adelaide. A later captain, Llewellyn Bowen, saw the passengers suffer an outbreak of scarlet fever on a trip to Adelaide. Many died from the outbreak, and, maybe even worse, the ship ended up crashing just offshore, between Grange and Semaphore, with messages in bottles needed to communicate between these stuck passengers and those gathered on shore. The clipper changed hands a few times after, but eventually was sold in 1893 and served as a floating isolation hospital. For 29 years, the city of Adelaide floated off British shores around Millbrook, housing the sick and those with easily transmissible diseases. Apparently, during just 1 year of the 29, over 20 different cases of scarlet fever broke out and were cared for aboard the clipper. If records exist online for how many people died during this period, I can't find them, but I can't imagine it was the best conditions for dealing with diseases. Eventually, the city of Adelaide was sold off to the Royal Navy, renamed the Carrack, as the Navy already had in Adelaide, and sailed off to Scotland to become a naval officers' club, seeing service to such figures as the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh. A newspaper stating, "It was fitted out as a naval officers' club with a lavish luxury that would have addled the imagination of the old seamen and scurvy rotted migrants who used to sail her." In 1989, the ship sprung a leak and sunk, being declared a total loss. It was eventually sold off for £1, and work to restore her was underway. Eventually, after a lot of political back and forth, the City of Adelaide was sold to the City of Adelaide, and was carefully transported across the sea in 2013. If you're in Adelaide today, it is a sight worth seeing firsthand, or you can tempt those who perished aboard and join a ghost tour of the ship, best done on a windy winter night. My song pairing for this story is one I've hinted at from the start. Bound for South Australia, also known as South Australia, or Rolling King, a sea shanty sung by those working on the clipper ships travelling between London and Adelaide, and as such is a song covered by many bands over the years, including the Wiggles. For today, I think the version sung by Port Issaac's Fisherman friends, as found on the Cambridge Folk Festival 2010-2011 album, is my pick of the bunch. Thursday, May 8th. On this day, not year, a princess is kept awake all night by a pea. Hans Christian Andersen was born April 2nd, 1805, in Odense, Denmark. The son of a shoemaker, a cobbler, his father would tell stories to him, saying they were descended from royalty, before enchanting him with tales from the Arabian Nights, or 1001 Nights book, a collection of Middle Eastern folk tales and stories. These likely left a lasting mark on the young Hans. Hans's father passed away when he was 11, and his mother remarried when he was 13. By 14, he had left the house and city, moving to Copenhagen, 160 kilometers or 100 miles away. Here he tried to become an actor, making use of his soprano voice. With no connection, he tried to forge his own, forcing meetings with established actors and barging into parties uninvited to showcase his talents. Surprisingly, this did actually work, for a while, until the young Hans's voice broke, and so did his soprano. Instead, a colleague told him that he could be a poet, and so Hans changed tact and started writing. Through good fortune and use of his connections, he was recommended to a good school, studying for 4 years before undertaking further study to gain entrance into a university. Over his life, he would go on to publish 156 fairy tales that he had collected and collated from all walks of life. From stories he heard on his travels around much of Europe, to those he remembered being told as a child from his father, or those from his grandfather, and others in an insane asylum, as the young Hans would sit all day and listen, as the women there spun 2 types of yarn. While the brothers Grimm, Hans's competition in a sense, would write and record their tales down as accurately as they could, Hans wasn't as pedantic, changing details and structure, inserting his own experiences, and even inventing his own tales to play alongside those from history and folklore. He's known as the father of many fairy tales still told today. The Emperor's New Clothes, a tale that grows more relevant by the day. Thumbelina, inspired by Tom Thumb. The Ugly Duckling, perhaps inspired by Hans's own gangly appearance. The Little Mermaid and the Snow Queen, 2 stories that Disney have kept relevant through their modern adaptations. And many, many more. However, all of these started on this day in 1835, when the first installment of Fairy Tales Told for Children was published. 61 pages detailing 4 fairy tales: The Tinderbox, Little Klaus and Big Klaus, The Princess and the Pea, and Little Ida's Flowers. Early reviews of these works weren't kind, critiquing the informal style and the lack of educating work found in these children's tales. This didn't stop others from enjoying them, however, the Danish works soon being translated into different languages, like German, and then from German into English. While much of the original wit and wordplay was lost, the stories still stoked the imagination of children the world over. A rather racist article from the New York Times in 1905, 70 years after the fairy tales were first published, emphasizes this fact. Stories have got entangled with the happiest memories of children the world over. German children have loved them, English children, American children, Spanish children, children in the far isles of the sea and away in the frozen north. And here's the casual racism. Even the little yellow pig-tailed children in China and the brown children in India know about the ugly duckling and the nightingale. Not all were fond of Hans Christian Andersen, however. After his star was on the rise and his name known the world over, he found himself in London, visiting another giant in the field of literature, Charles Dickens. Hans was to spend a few nights crashing with Dickens, which soon turned into a week, then 2, 3, and 4, before finally 5 had passed and Hans was off. Dickens putting up a sign when he finally left, reading, "Hans Andersen slept in this room for 5 weeks, which seemed to the family ages." Hans Christian Andersen passed away in 1875, at age 70. The last few years of his life spent weak and ill, but he remained happy to greet a guest, telling those that visited, No, I shall never be well enough to travel again," and informing those making plans to visit again in the future, "I shall not be alive then." And although he may not be alive now, he lives on through his legacy and his fairy tales that continue to delight children around the world. An obvious song pairing, but sometimes that's the most fitting. For this story, I'm taking a song from the 1952 Kaye-led musical, Hans Christian Andersen, a very loosely inspired movie around the life of Hans. The song for today is I'm Hans Christian Andersen by Kaye. Friday, May 9th. On this day, not year, sports fans got more than they bargained for at this game. Tear gas. As per cdc.gov, chemical compounds that temporarily make people unable to function. It does this by causing irritation to the eyes, mouth, throat, lungs, and skin. An article on kansascity.com has various first-hand experiences from those who have been tear-gassed. Your eyes start to get pretty watery, and it kind of feels like the air is disappearing around you, states one. It felt like running through campfire smoke, spiked with jalapeno spice, reads another. While maybe 1 in 10 are immune to the compounds found in tear gas, it is still going to affect the other 9, who, as the one will soon find out, are in some hurry to flee the gas, no matter what or who gets in their way. But for now, put all this information to the back of your mind as we travel to Accra, the capital city of the West African country of Ghana. Accra comes from a word meaning ants. But despite containing a little over 5.5 million people, the city is no anthill. With a tourism trade that sees over 1 million international visitors each year, and historical sites left behind by various settlers, Accra has something for everyone. But perhaps the most popular activity can be found at the Accra Sports Stadium, which is where our story takes place today, back in 2001. The local soccer, or football if you prefer, team of Accra is the Hearts of Oak, founded in 1911 with red, yellow and blue as their club colours. They are the only team in West Africa to have won a continental treble, which involves winning in the top-level domestic league, main domestic league, and main continental trophy. Their rivals are the Porcupine Warriors, or Asante Kotoko, a club founded in 1935. Tonight, April 9th, 2001, these two teams just happened to be playing against each other in the Accra Sports Stadium. First opened in 1961, the stadium has seen some fierce competition over the years, and even a presidential assassination attempt via grenade. But tonight would go down as the deadliest event the stadium would ever witness. Extra security was brought in for the game, as tensions between the fans were at an all-time high. As soon as the 40,000 spectators had entered, the doors to the stadium were locked. For the majority of the game, things went smoothly. Asante Kotoko took an early lead, but two late-game goals by Hearts of Oak sealed their victory, much to the displeasure of the Kotoko fans. They made this known to the players by bombarding the field with whatever was at hand, even ripping out the plastic seating and lobbing it down. Between the rising tension and violence, many fans tried to make their way out, heading for one of the few exits. Engineers had made compromises on the stadium design and included less exits than planned. Fans reached them only to find the doors locked, as more people started crowding in behind them, compacting those in the front. It was then that the security reacted. Local police began firing tear gas into the crowds. Multiple canisters spread the irritant over the fans, while plastic bullets were also fired into the crowds. Panic spread, sending more fleeing towards the already crowded exits. A crowd crush, or crowd collapse, as per Wikipedia, is when numbers reach between 8 and 10 people per square metre. Individuals become pressed against each other and may be swept along against their will. In such scenarios, every breath in constricts your lungs just that little bit more. You're helpless to control your motion, acting more like a human liquid than a solid. If you fall, you're done for, and even if you remain standing, you may be so compacted that breathing becomes impossible. A condition known as compressive asphyxia. This was the situation that many in the Accra Sports Stadium found themselves in. When the panic eventually cleared and the crowds dispersed, many lay dead or injured. Numbers weren't clear at first. The government was claiming 50 to 60 deaths, while a radio broadcast put the number closer to 100. In reality, 126 had died in the stadium that day, marking it today as the third deadliest event in football history. Maybe a dark choice of pairing, but my pick of song for this story is by Martha Reeves and the Vamdellas, with Nowhere to Run. Saturday, May 10th. On this day, not year, it was going to cost you to get your $5 a day. Tariffs. By now, that's probably a word we are all sick of. But it's not a new word by any means, and has been a headache for people well before the current emperor, the president, started his love affair with the word. Today finds us in 1893 and back in America. The John Nix & Co. Fruit Commission had been operating since 1839, and by all measures was succeeding as a company. They were one of the first in New York to ship produce in from across the country, and even from overseas. A new set of tariffs in 1883, nicknamed the Mongrel Tariff Act, was forcing changes across the country. but more specifically, changes for Nix & Co. Vegetables were going to see a 10% tariff added. Fortunately, Nix & Co. were shipping in tomatoes direct from the West Indies, and they are a fruit, right? Let's turn to our ever-faithful Wikipedia. The tomato is a plant whose fruit is an edible berry. Well, that clears it up. Wait, there's more. That is eaten as a vegetable. Well, that just confounds the matter. It was this ambiguity that Nix & Co. hoped to use to continue skirting the tariff laws. Unfortunately, a customs collector named Edward L. Hedden was wise to this and nixed Nix & Co., having them cough up the veggie tax if they wanted their goods. Nix paid, but it wasn't to be the end of the story. Soon, Hedden found himself looking down the barrel of a lawsuit, and on the 24th of April, the court was in session. Nix v. Hedden. Nix and their lawyers argued that, botanically speaking, a tomato was a fruit, and exempt from the tariff. They even had the dictionary definition to back them up. It was a very heated court case. To quote supreme.justia.com, "The defendant's counsel then read in evidence from Webster's dictionary the definitions of the words pea, eggplant, cucumber, squash, and pepper. The plaintiff then read in evidence from Webster's and Worcester's dictionaries the definitions of potato, turnip, parsnip, cauliflower, cabbage, carrot, and bean." Essentially, this high-stakes court case came down to lawyers reading out definitions of different plants from a dictionary. The judge, a Mr. Justice Gray, eventually ruling on this day, "Botanically speaking, tomatoes are the fruit of a vine, just as are cucumbers, squashes, beans, and peas. But in the common language of the people, whether sellers or consumers of provisions, all these are vegetables which are grown in kitchen gardens, and which, whether eaten cooked or raw, are, like potatoes, carrots, parsnips, turnips, beets, cauliflower, cabbage, celery, and lettuce, usually served at dinner, in, with, or after the soup fish or meats, which constitute the principal part of the repast, and not, like fruits, generally as dessert." Which, to summarize, was basically the judge saying tomatoes aren't a dessert, therefore aren't a fruit. Although, today, just to muddy the argument further, you can get tomato ice cream, which is very much a dessert. This hasn't been the only strange food court case in history. 1991 saw a UK court deciding if Jaffa cakes were biscuits or cakes. The answer would allow the manufacturers to skirt the British VAT, or value-added tax. While the US Congress in 2011 signed a law that pizza with at least 2 tablespoons of tomato paste counted as a vegetable. And food adjacent, a Californian court in 2022 ruled that bees were considered as fish. So, just to recap as we end this story, tomatoes are scientifically fruit, but legally vegetables, especially when tariffs are involved, and can also turn pizza into a vegetable when present in high enough concentration. And as tomato plants are self-pollinating, they don't need the honey-producing land fish to help them grow their edible berries. Got that? Good. After a story like this, I can only think of one song that fits. Fruit Salad by the Wiggles. Sunday, May 11th. On this day, not year, an arson-laden corpse was dug up. In the quiet French countryside, 190 miles out of Paris, Léon Bénard, and Marie Josephine Philippine de Villiers were married in 1928. It wasn't Marie's first marriage. 8 years prior, she had married a cousin, Auguste, who only just recently passed away the year prior. All was well for the happy couple for a decade, but soon a string of tragedies struck the family. Léon's parents had recently come into a small fortune from inheritance, and in 1940 were invited to live with Léon and Marie for a while. Unfortunately, the house of 4 soon became 3, as Léon's father passed from a poisonous mushroom. C'est la vie. It was only months later that Léon's mother passed too, apparently of pneumonia. This left the Baynard estate and inherited fortune to their 2 children, Léon and Lucie. Only, wouldn't you know it, Lucie soon passed too, supposedly by her own hand. It seemed this curse was spreading, leaving the Baynard family tree alone and now targeting Marie's, as her father died soon after. Léon and Marie began subletting their newly empty rooms to a wealthy couple, Toussaint and Blanche Reeves, old friends of Marie's father. They soon joined him, Toussaint passing first, pneumonia again, and Blanche shortly after, from an aortic inflammation. Fortunately, before their untimely demise, they had changed their will to give everything to Marie. Things settled once more for a few years, and then 2 of Marie's cousins, Pauline and Virginie, took a turn for the worse after eating a tainted dessert, and passed one after the other. But not before listing Marie as the sole inheritor to their possessions. Somewhere in all of this, a great-aunt passed away too. By now, the Baynard couple were doing rather well in life, having inherited from various family or friends 10 million francs, 2 farms, 6 houses, an inn, and a cafe. Perhaps this sudden rise in wealth and stature is what caused Léon to not only seek out a mistress, but invite her to start living with himself and Marie. Not one to remain idle, Marie herself soon sought out a paramour of her own, much to Léon's protests. This wasn't all Léon was protesting about either, stating to friends that he was being poisoned, and that if he were to suddenly pass, that an autopsy should be performed. In 1947, he did die suddenly, and although it raised some eyebrows, it didn't cause the stir Léon perhaps hoped. That is, until Marie's mother passed away 2 years later, and finally people started asking questions. Although some sources have the mother passing away first, and Léon's mistress being the one to keep pestering authorities until action was taken. On this day, May 11th in 1949, Léon's body was exhumed and tested. This soon led to the other bodies being dug up and examined too. Marie's first husband, Auguste, was found to have 60 milligrams of arsenic in his remains. Marie's father had 36 milligrams of arsenic. The Reeves couple had 18 in his and 30 in hers. Marie's cousins, Pauline and Virginie, had 48 and 20 respectively. Marie's mother had 48 milligrams in her remains, while Léon himself less than half of that at 19. The other bodies in the story, Léon's father, mother, sister, and great-aunt, all had varying levels of arsenic in their corpses too. The poison, the arsenic, supposedly came from a bottle of potato bug killer, an insecticide, to keep crops pest-free. It was alleged that Marie would pour this liquid poison into wines, soups, any dish she was serving to slowly poison her victims and gain their inheritance. This was only ever alleged, however, as despite 3 trials, including one where Marie Curie's son-in-law was involved, before passing away himself, no word on if he was poisoned, Marie Baynard was never found guilty of these crimes. Each trial saw the evidence collapse under questioning, as experts couldn't agree over minutiae, or the defense found that arsenic may have been leached into the bodies from tainted soil in the cemetery. By 1961, nearly 10 years after the first trial had started, the third trial ended, and Marie, or the Queen of Poisoners, was a free woman, claiming innocence right up until her death in 1980. Only one song compare with this story. Tom Waits's Little Drop of Poison. I like my town with a little drop of poison. I'm all alone. I smoke my friends down to the filter. Lyrics that describe the life of Marie Baynard quite well. As that was the end of Sunday, that can only mean the beginning of the quiz. I hope you've been paying attention throughout. Pens and paper at the ready. And as usual, feel free to pause, reverse, etc. This is all just a bit of fun after all. Right, here we are. Question 1 for Monday. Which finger left behind the print that saw the Stratton brothers face justice? Question 2 for Tuesday. What was the potato variety that contributed to the Irish famine? Question 3 for Wednesday. It took the First Fleet 252 days, but what was the quickest run the city of Adelaide had between England and Australia? Question 4 for Thursday. How long did Hans Andersen crash at Charles Dickens's? Question 5 for Friday. Name just one of the teams that played Accra Stadium on the day of our story. Question 6 for Saturday. What is a tomato? No, just kidding. What dictionary did both defendant and plaintiff favour in this court case? Question 7 for Sunday. How many trials did the Queen of Poisoners, Marie Baynard, face before being declared innocent? Right, got something down for each of them? Well, I hope so, as here are the answers. Answer 1, Monday. The right thumb was the finger that left behind the print in the Stratton case. Answer 2 for Tuesday. The potato variety was the Irish lumper. Answer 3 for Wednesday. The city of Adelaide clocked in a speed of 65 days between England and Australia. Answer 4 for Thursday. Hans Andersen stayed with Charles Dickens for 5 weeks, which seemed ages. Answer 5 for Friday. The two teams that played were the Hearts of Oak and Asante Kotoko. Answer 6 for Saturday. While Worcester's and the Imperial Dictionary were used, both sides seemed to favour Webster's Dictionary for their definitions. And answer 7 for Sunday. The Queen of Poisoners faced 3 trials, although debate still rages on over her innocence. Which brings us to the end of another episode of TDNY. This day, not year. If you've made it this far, thanks for listening. While I do enjoy all of this, the research, writing, and prattling away for hours at a time, in the end it's the interactions and the comments from you, the listeners, that really make all this worthwhile. So with that said, thank you again. And as per usual, if you're feeling particularly extroverted today, why not share this podcast with a friend or family member who you think may enjoy it too? Or failing that, a rate and a like helps the podcast out too. As ever, if you want to reach me, I'm contactable on thisdaynotyear@gmail.com. I've been Adam. You've been listening to This Day Not Year, and I hope you join me again next week, where we'll be looking back at May 12th to May 18th. Until then, I hope you have an historic week. Bye.